Supah Ritz, Volume 2, The Phoenix Years. The Promotion, Part 1. It became quickly apparent that my plan to attain a promotion at Phoenix Pictures through a shock and awe campaign of eager beaver dedication would prove harder than I expected. On my first day, I arrived promptly at 8:30 a.m. to find the office completely deserted. Mike's partner, Arnie Messer, the COO of Phoenix Pictures, arrived early but cloistered himself in his vast office, behind an unruly barricade of inter-party agreements, smoking cigars and allegedly playing solitaire all day. It would be hard to find an opportunity to impress him. He did come out occasionally to grab a glass of iced tea and ask me to clean the kitchen. There's an ethos you're taught early on in Hollywood, that if you're hired to sweep the floor, be the best damn floor sweeper they've ever seen. But I didn't feel like I'd been hired to clean the kitchen. Also, I sucked at it. There was no dishwasher and nowhere to stack the dirty mugs piling up in the sink. Cleaning the kitchen was a recipe for failure. But such was the nature of the early days of Phoenix Pictures. It was essentially a startup. There were no systems in place, no IT department or human resources. The only support staff on the team was me. If I wanted an opportunity to prove myself, it was going to take more than just smarts. It was probably going to involve some drudgery. And the opportunity I was looking for was likely something I was going to have to create myself. One of the first problems I encountered on assuming my new job was that, much to my horror, Mike did not rely on a phone sheet. What? What was the purpose in life if not to maintain the phone sheet? Instead, we had a booklet of message slips. Every time a call came in, you scrawled it on a slip, ripped it out of the book, and put it in Mike's inbox on his desk. You were left with a carbon copy of the message that became a kind of record of the day's business. This seemed anathema to me. It was too analog even for my taste. It was the same bourgeois system my parents used to keep track of messages at home. It's what I was fleeing. Moreover, how could we expect to succeed if we were not using the very cutting edge of phone message management technology to track Hollywood's most powerful currency, the phone call? Mike also did not roll calls. In part, we were just not that busy, but it was also not his style. He made his own calls unless he was in his car. But when he was in his car, he generally relied on his second assistant, Richard, to make the calls for him. This also seemed crazy to me. Richard was an affable former tennis pro who had gotten to know Mike, I assumed, through Mike's legendary Saturday morning tennis game. This was an invitation-only Hollywood institution where quality players could mix and mingle with Hollywood elite. There were generally 2 matches, followed by a lunch. Guys like Richard, willing to keep the ball in play at any cost, were invaluable for these kinds of games. An invite to Mike Medavoy's Saturday morning tennis might get you an opportunity to meet an executive or a star who might help you get your movie made. In Richard's case, it kissed him into Mike's entourage, the informal gang of personal and professional friends that orbited Mike like a planetary system, picking up small opportunities and sucking them into their orbit. In Richard's case, Mike's gravitational pull led to an entry-level position at the nascent Phoenix Pictures. This was not an uncommon story. I loved Richard. He was a quintessential SoCal boy with a surfer's demeanor, a perpetual tan, an athletic build, and an aw-shucks humility about his tennis prowess, his skills as a card trader, and his finesse with women. But he was not a film guy. He loved movies and he longed for something more glorious in his life than selling cars, but you need at least a drop of shark DNA to survive in Hollywood, and he had none of it. I couldn't understand why Mike was putting him in charge of something as vital as his calls. Would Richard sleep on the floor next to the copy machine to make sure a 1,000-page manuscript was ready to go out at first light? I doubted it. And if he was rolling Mike's calls, how would I ever know if Mike needed to figure out how to smuggle a kidney biopsy through customs to get it to the experimental lab in Tübingen? You wrap it like a birthday gift, by the way. My parents did it once for my stepbrother. What's more, if the actual truth be told, there was just not that much happening at Phoenix Pictures in the summer of 1995. Mike and Arnie were still raising money and negotiating distribution deals, and the town was skeptical that Mike was going to pull it off. The skepticism was justified. Savoy Pictures, a similarly structured financing entity formed in 1992, was already faltering. Stanley Jaffe, the former head of Paramount, was struggling to raise money at the same time as Mike for a competing deal at Sony. Jaffe's deal never came together. Bill Mechanic, the former head of 20th Century Fox, would try and fail to launch a similar entity just a few years later. Agents didn't want to send us material or clients. I felt bad for Mike in those early days at Phoenix, cast out of the executive suite at TriStar and relegated to the junky Frankovich building that wasn't even on the lot. Town no longer clamoring for his attention. He seemed kind of lost and lonely to me, shuffling out of the building on a slow Friday, his giant script bag slung over his shoulder, his trusty German shepherd, Rocky, at his feet. It all felt very Autumn of the Patriarch to me. But Mike clearly did not see it that way. He showed up at work every day in his suit and tie with his list of calls and tried to make things happen. It seemed kind of futile to me, but Mike's determination and tenacity remain a lesson I took with me from those early days. Just keep going, even when it seems pointless. You never know when the tide is going to turn, and you better be ready for when it happens. Mike worked the phones diligently, and nothing pissed him off quite like when his friends or former colleagues would try to dump his calls off their phone sheets. In the 90s, in Hollywood, no call went unreturned. That was just the way of it. But a lot of people would return a call when they knew the person they were trying to reach would not be available. This was called dumping calls. When you dumped a call, you got credit for maintaining protocol, even if everyone knew what you were really up to. The most common strategy to dump calls was to simply return the calls after hours. Just wait until the office emptied out, and then clear the phone sheet, leaving messages on people's voicemails. Hey, it's not your fault they don't work as hard as you. Another common strategy was to return calls during lunch, the hour and a half between 1 and 2:30 when all of Hollywood broke to break bread with each other at industry eateries around town. If you tried calling someone during those hours, it meant you were not trying to get them on the phone. You were just trying to get them off your phone sheet. Mike's former assistant, Mark Canton, who had become chairman of Sony Pictures and would soon be overseeing our deal if it ever came together, regularly tried to dump Mike's calls during lunch. Sometimes if Mike's lunch canceled, or he had no lunch scheduled at all, he would just sit at his desk between 1 and 2:30 like a bear in the rapids, waiting for the salmon to jump in his jaw. He relished catching people like Canton trying to clear him off their phone sheet. He'd chortle with glee when I'd put them through to his desk. Sometimes an assistant wouldn't even have their boss on the phone, so they would have to hang up in a panic before Mike could pick up. When Mike became one of the first people in Hollywood to get a mobile cell phone in late 1995, people practically shit themselves when we started putting them through to Mike's table at some restaurant during lunch. The cell phone basically ended that game. Still, when I screwed up the courage to suggest to Mike I wanted to run his calls so I could sit in and listen, I think my eagerness alerted his suspicions, his instincts to guard his privacy. He had spent some recent time in the spotlight, enduring a high-profile divorce from Patricia Duff and an ignominious exit from TriStar. He told me I could listen to whatever calls I liked through the open door of his office. Well, this was basically a fair point, as Mike generally kept an open door, and you could listen in on most of his calls to find out what was happening. It still felt like a major setback on my journey to earn his intimacy and trust. Indeed, his indebtedness. Another struggle on this journey was Mike's increasing frustration over the continued state of his outdated Rolodex. In fact, we didn't even have a Rolodex. We had a bulky Naugahyde phone book that looked like it had been plucked from Mike's home office. It sat on a kind of miniature lectern, and Richard and I would trade it between desks depending on who was wielding the phone. But sometimes Mike might need a number, and he'd bellow for it from inside his office. And if the book wasn't on your desk, you had to jump to the other person's desk and rifle through the pages in search of the number. Even at the very dawn of the digital age, this was an unwieldy and unacceptably time-consuming process. While we had begun to digitize new contacts into the aptly named contact indexing software called Contacts, Mike was growing more and more annoyed that we had not managed to digitize his older contacts so that either one of us could pull a number off the computer at a moment's notice. When Mike blew up at me about it one afternoon, he was not prone to raise his voice. I decided to take matters into hands of my own. For several Sundays in a row, I dragged my hungover ass down to the dilapidated Frankovich building, typed my code into the security box, and climbed the steps to the deserted top floor to manually input the old contacts into the digital Rolodex. I wasn't getting extra compensation for this, and no one was aware that I was doing this, but I believed the work had to get done. It would eventually get notice. I also have always believed on any job that I am on the brink of getting fired. I worry that the ongoing contacts crisis might just be the straw that broke the camel's back. I didn't mind it either. The deserted office late at night brought back memories of all-night college study jams and a world where hard work rarely failed to yield results. It was kind of comforting. The tedious work was also an effective penance, a well-earned self-flagellation for whatever weekend shenanigans I had inevitably subjected my body to. I'd also take breaks from the data entry here and there to tackle the weekend read, a time-consuming beast that stalked every weekend's fun. It was on one of these Sundays at about 9 p.m., when I'd been at the office for a good 5 hours, determined to finally break the back on this monster, that the phone rang. This was before the days of caller ID, so I had no idea who might be calling Phoenix Pictures at 9 p.m. I didn't always answer the phone when I was there alone. This was my time, and really it was more than likely some desperate writer, some sad sack from Mike's past, who I would have to humor for 10 minutes instead of powering through the monumental task before me. Still, on this night, I decided to pick it up, and lo and behold, it was Mike. He chuckled delightedly at the sound of my voice, just thrilled that someone seemed to care about his new company with something close to the care he felt himself. I told him what I was doing there, and he gave me some meaningless reminder for the coming week, and that was it. But I knew on some level I had proved my worth. Sure, I had been a decent enough assistant, but I am convinced to this day that this tiny bit of evidence of my unquestioned dedication, burning the midnight oil on a Sunday night, tipped the balance irrevocably in my favor, reinforcing whatever goodwill Mike already felt toward my career. My suspicions were reinforced a few days later when Mike's sole development executive, Christy Prunier, swaggered up to my desk and told me conspiratorially that she had been in the car with Mike that Sunday evening when he called. She told me that Mike had been telling me how great he thought I was, and to prove it, had dialed the office because he bet I'd be there. She seemed stunned that he was right. What's more, she confided, Mike and she had discussed considering me for the role of story editor at Phoenix Pictures, should the company's financing ever come together. This was actually the job I had dreamed of. At the studios, the most junior-level creative position was the creative executive, a.k.a. the CE. There were like 25 studio-level CE jobs in all of Hollywood, and CEs were their own little club. I longed to be one of them, a self-important suit running around town, having lunches and compiling lists, but I didn't believe I was ready for it. I didn't know what made for a good or bad director. I didn't know any screenwriters. I had no relationships with agents who might funnel me scripts. I felt pretty confident I'd drown if I became a CE. There was, however, a more junior spot at companies like Phoenix, where some administrative responsibilities were bundled with creative responsibilities and a path for further promotion: the story editor. The story editor's main job was to hire, fire, and manage the company's team of readers. Freelancers who read scripts and wrote summaries and analysis, coverage for about $45 a pop. The story editor would also write and compile notes on the company's projects and ultimately track material, find scripts and books that might be right for the company to buy. The story editor role appealed to me because I could see how in coordinating the readers, I would provide value immediately. And I hoped the more networky side of the job, cultivating relationships with agents and producers, could be something I might grow into. Suddenly, Christy was dangling this dream job right in my face. I don't know what Christy's creative bona fides were prior to coming to Phoenix, but I suspect they were not much more extensive than my own. Still, she seemed to have Mike's trust entirely when it came to creative matters, and I thoroughly believed it was within her power to crush my prospects at Phoenix if she so chose. To her credit, she never presented herself to me as anything other than an ally and a friend. When she dangled the prospect of the story editor job before me, she made it clear it was a notion that had her support. There were no explicit caveats. Maybe there were no implicit caveats either. But I believed that implicit in the promise of Christie's support was the idea that if I wanted to continue to enjoy that support, I better continue to toe her creative line. I believed the key to my relationship with her was to always present myself as a creative asset rather than a creative threat. While I still wanted to prove to Mike that I could be a valuable new voice, capable of bringing fresh perspective to the table, I was always careful not to make creative waves, lest my access to the creative process, and more importantly to Mike, be curtailed. On the other hand, if I made no waves at all, I would be relying solely on Christie's goodwill and support to get me the promotion I craved. While I didn't trust anyone enough to put my fate in their hands, it seemed clear to me that if I allied myself thoroughly with Christie, it would at least get me off Mike's desk and into an office of my own. The dynamic left me feeling a bit neutered, but it is a dynamic as old as Hollywood development itself. As a creative executive, you're always negotiating between various creative visions, including your own. Sometimes the job is to just suppress your own vision and execute the vision of your higher-ups. Largely in those days at Phoenix, that was the path I chose. A few weeks after that Sunday evening call, the financing for Phoenix Pictures came together. As I understood it, a consortium of media companies that included Showtime, Sony, Pearson, and Jerry Schwartz, the chairman of Canadian investment firm Onyx, provided the company's equity. I believe Ron Burkle was an early investor as well. The movies were then financed through a combination of Phoenix's equity, output deals with Showtime, Sony, and Canal+, Japanese pre-sales, and an insurance component wherein insurance companies would insure the gap in our financing, essentially thereby providing bankable paper. I'm pretty sure our first couple movies nearly drove the insurers into insolvency. The story of Phoenix closing its financing ran in the trades, Variety, Hollywood Reporter, the LA Times, on a Monday morning. Mike came to the office that day with a yellow pad filled with letters he had drafted to the many colleagues he'd interacted with over the course of the recent couple years in which he had been working to pull the company together. They were all variations on the same theme. Mike thanked them for their support and included a copy of the trade announcement in the envelopes that I then sent out. It struck me as a strange mix of recipients, but halfway through the process I recognized enough names to understand they all shared a common theme. They had all told Mike the company would never happen. Boy, do I understand this impulse. I keep an ongoing list of all the unreturned calls, the emails that have gone unanswered, the submissions left unread. I fantasize about sending every motherfucker on that list an email, but I doubt I'll ever have the chance to do it. Mike got his chance, and he took it. Mike immediately began staffing up. His first hire was Marcia Nassiter, our senior creative executive. Marcia was a Hollywood legend. She had been the very first woman to become a studio vice president, and she had been Mike's partner in crime at United Artists. They had had enormous success together, which they hoped to replicate at Phoenix. Marcia had more recently produced The Big Chill and was joining Phoenix from her partnership with Stephen Haft. While Marcia eventually became a great friend, the Jewish grandmother I'd always missed, our relationship got off to a rocky start. She really wanted Mike to hire her junior executive, David Craig. My darling David Craig, as she would always refer to him for the rest of her life, to run the story department. She told me as much when she emerged from her second interview with Mike, and I asked her if she was going to be joining the company. If they can make my deal, she told me sardonically. And then she added, I really wanted them to hire my dear David Craig to run the story department, but I guess they've already settled on you. She sighed deeply, hoisted her bag over her shoulder, and sauntered out of the room. And that's how I found out that Mike and Christy had stuck to their guns. I was getting promoted.